Renee Schaaf.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, I am so impressed. First off, can you hear me? Sweet. And you'll tell me if you can't, right? Don't let me just go on. Okay. I have to tell you, I'm very, very impressed that a group of students would actually come this time of the day to hear somebody talk about strategy. Congratulations to you all. You either are getting credit for this, or there's something else that's driving you. How many of you, I know, are about all of you in the College of Business? Yes, okay. How many of you are in international studies? Okay, so some. How about management? Marketing? IS? Finance? Accounting? Entrepreneurial studies? Yay! And what am I missing? Actuarial and econ. Actuarial, somebody? Oh, wow, good for you guys. They're really smart people. That's good, that's good. Well, I am so pleased that you're here. I have a connection to Drake. I graduated with an MBA from Drake many years ago. And I've made a lot of contacts and a lot of friends from Drake. I recently hired a guy who graduated from Drake, Ken Yu. Consuelo is up there, the daughter of my boss, to give me a report back. No pressure. And Diego, who is working at Principal and has at least affiliated very closely with Principal. So there's a number of you that I've had the opportunity to meet with over the time. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. What I'm hoping to cover with you today is a little bit about my background. I'd like to talk to you about Principal International, what we do. I would like to talk to you about my view of what strategy is and what we get from strategy and why it's important, why it's so darned hard. I would like to talk to you about working in an international business environment, some of my own personal observations, and what I see as skills needed for success if you're interested in international business or strategy or really business. And then I'm hoping that we can open it up, and I hope you have a lot of questions, because without knowing more about what you are interested in, my fear is I'm not going to capture that. So I'll try to leave time so that you can ask questions and we can go where you want to go, if that makes sense. Okay. So a little bit about me. Like I said, I am a Drake graduate. I'm also an Iowa State graduate. No tomatoes, please? No tomatoes? But I graduated from Iowa State in marketing and management many years ago, and then started to work at Principal right after I graduated, and then went to night school to get my MBA at Drake. And my family is probably the way that I first became very, very interested in things that are international. I have two daughters. My oldest daughter works in advertising. She lives in Los Angeles. She works for an agency. And my youngest daughter is in Iowa State. She's a senior in Iowa State in global resources. And I would say that throughout the time that my kids were growing up, we always had a lot of kids with us. And we had a lot of international kids. We had a girl from France live with us for off and on over a couple of years. We had a guy from Italy. We had a guy from Austria. My niece lived with us for a while. So what happened was, when my oldest daughter went to, actually she moved to Los Angeles, my youngest daughter and my niece had moved out. For the first time ever, my youngest daughter was an only child. And we were at dinner, my husband and I, and Danica. And Danica pushes back from the table and she says, "This isn't going to work." I'm like, "Well, what's not going to work, honey?" "This, me being an only child, this isn't going to work." Well, I really don't have any solutions for that. So I said, "You know, it's a problem that you're going to have to solve, because we've got the space." So what happened is, like, the very next day, she came home with all of the papers to take a foreign exchange student from Shanghai. Her name is Li Xing. And so Li Xing came to live with us about 6 years ago when she was 16 years old, and long story short, she's never gone home. And now she now has her degree in chemical engineering, and she works for Monsanto She lives in Muscatine, and we see her far more than I see my biological daughters. So it worked. In Danica's view, this all worked just fine. She slid out from underneath the main stage, and I ended up with, or we ended up with an acquired daughter from China, which really began to open up my eyes about the influence of other cultures, the influence of China in our world. It really piqued my curiosity and my interest in all things international. I've already said things about my education. I'm Iowa educated, but believe me, you'll see this too, your education doesn't stop when you get that degree from Drake. You keep learning, and it actually is more interesting in my view. I loved college, loved Iowa State, loved Drake, but it's nothing like what you are actually going to learn when you're in the job playing for real. It's far more interesting. The stakes feel higher because sometimes they are. But I've had a wonderful opportunity to be Iowa educated, and it's prepared me well. And in terms of professional experience, you know, I was thinking about this. I am perhaps one of the luckiest people at Principal. Over the course of my career, I've been in charge, or I've been the head of a distribution arm that did direct selling, direct distribution through the internet and direct mail, telephone. I've worked in operations. I've been in charge of marketing. I've been in charge of strategy and merger and acquisitions. I've run divisions within our retirement side of the house, within our health insurance side of the house, within wellness. So I've had P&L responsibilities in 3 diverse industries. I've been in charge or been involved with startup organizations like our wellness company. I've been involved with mature operations. If you don't remember your product portfolio where you have the cash cows and the stars. So very much involved with the mature business, which is our retirement and investor services. And I even had the opportunity to do a wind down of our health division, which was, I think, a whole other topic. And actually, I've also spoke to Drake graduate students on that experience. That was really interesting, by the way. I won't go into it today, but there's a ton of things you can learn about winding down an operation. So I've been extraordinarily lucky, and all of that within one company, which is very, very, very rare, and something that I tell my daughters will probably never happen to them. It's just a fact of the environment, the business environment that we're in today. So now maybe a little bit about Principal International. That's the division that I work in now. I've worked for Principal International for the last year and a half, and my focus is on strategy. I am responsible for working with all of our countries to make sure that the strategy is consistent, that it's differentiated, and that we communicate it well to internal audiences, to external audiences like the analysts and rating agencies, shareholders, as well as our board. I have a fair amount of interaction with the PFG board, really in helping the guy that I report to, Luis Valdez, who, by the way, how many of you have heard Luis Valdez speak? Aha! Or Ned Burmeister, the other guy. Yeah, they're kind of regulars here as well. So I work very close. I report to Luis, and Ned is a peer. So we are in both Latin America and in Asia with Principal International. And there are really distinct differences between our businesses in Latin America and in Asia. First off, just taking a look at Latin America. So we're in Chile, Mexico, and Brazil. And we entered those markets in the 90s. Our longest standing market is Mexico that we're still in. And the thing that's interesting about our Latin America business is that it's relatively homogeneous in terms of the product offerings that we make available. We're really focused on retirement products, so retirement and long-term savings in Latin America. So it would be the 401k equivalent, or in Mexico and in Chile, they actually have mandatory retirement systems that have been privatized. So remember years and years ago when President Bush was talking about privatizing Social Security? Well, Mexico and Chile actually did that. And so we play in those markets. We also have mutual fund offerings in Chile and in Mexico. And in Brazil, it is predominantly a mutual fund-like market with lots and lots of tax advantages. We have the biggest and the deepest footprint in Latin America. 90% of our investments have been in Latin America, and 90% of our profits then come from Latin America as well. In Asia, we are doing business in India, China, Hong Kong, and in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia includes Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore. We have entered these markets a little bit more recently, with the exception of Hong Kong, which was also a 1990s entrance. And the difference between Latin America and Asia is that the laws and the tax advantages that are associated with retirement savings, because remember, with Principal International, what we're doing is we're taking the retirement expertise that we have domestically in the U.S., and we're exporting that into Asia and into Latin America. So in Asia, most of the governments have not paved the way for a 401k-like offering, nor have they made tax advantages for individual savings. Like we have the IRA here, the individual retirement account that you can save up to $5,000 and get a tax defer. They don't have those similar laws in most of the markets in Asia. So as a result, when you look at our business in Asia, it's a very mutual fund heavy market. It's only in Hong Kong where we do have some pension business, and just starting in Malaysia. So there are some pretty big differences in the feel and the makeup of those two markets. But in general, what we're doing, our strategy, is to take what we know, the franchise that we've built in the U.S. around retirement and long-term savings, and we're exporting that into our Latin America and Asia operations. How many of you are familiar, have heard Principal Global Investors? Yeah? Okay. Let me just real quickly tell you the difference between Principal International and Principal Global Investors. Principal Global Investors is an investment, they specialize in asset management, cross-border flows. So their clients are big institutions, sovereign wealth funds, governments, big pension plans, and they're managing money with a global feel. So their customers are interested in buying assets from a number of different countries. Principal International is focused on going into a country, starting business in that country, and selling to the people who live in that country. Okay? There is, of course, another way that we think about PI and PGI. Not a very well communicated way, certainly unorthodox. And that is, if you work in Principal Global Investors and you work in the asset management side, you are typically going to spots like London and Sydney and places in Ireland and places that are very Hong Kong, Singapore, places that are highly established, very cosmopolitan, places that you read about on the top 10 world places to travel. If you work in Principal International, you have to have shots. And those are the countries that you go to. It's a small joke, but in all seriousness, there is a difference between Principal International and Principal Global Investors, and PI requires a very, very deep understanding of the local markets that you serve, that we serve. So like I said, I focus on strategic planning and business development. So what is strategy, and why is it important? Well, everybody and every company is going to have a slightly different view of strategy. At the Principal, when we think of strategy, we are thinking about a plan that helps us differentiate ourselves from the competition and that delivers superior economic performance, meaning growth and profitability. And the reason that our strategy is so important to us is that it tells you what you should be focusing on, and almost more importantly, what you shouldn't be focusing on. Because what we typically find as in the course of doing business, when somebody has a really good idea for how a business can grow, how you can bring in new revenues, how you can make additional profits, and if they have a solid business plan that backs that, and it looks like it's going to have a good return on investment or return on equity, without a solid strategy, you don't know whether that's really a good business venture and one that you should invest your time and resources in or not. And a lot of really well-established, maintained companies can very quickly go off the path of their strategy and get into markets that don't fit, and then they end up not having the right expertise, not having the right DNA to make those markets successful, and it increases their chance of failure. So I would say one of the best things about, or one of the most important things about strategy is that it not only tells you where to focus, but it also tells you where not to focus and what to say no to in order to really focus your resources. There are 5 tests of a good strategy. One is having a distinctive value proposition, which gets into differentiating yourself from the competition, and then tailoring your whole value chain around that differential so that you really do stand apart in the marketplace. There's a lot of trade-offs that have to come into play because money and people are finite resources. And so you have to decide what your business mix is that you're going to use to support that strategy that really is going to differentiate you in the marketplace. And then you have to look across to make all of the value chain to make sure everything's lined up, and to make sure that there's good continuity and consistency across the organization. This sounds really easy, right? And do any of you recognize this? That this is not principle made. This actually came from the father of strategy. Do you recognize this is Michael Porter? This is Michael Porter's foundation framework for strategy. And it's really a solid one. So anyway, the thing that makes this so hard is that there are so many competing views on ways to make the strategy work, or short-term opportunities that we can or should take advantage of in order to generate short-term growth and profitability. And as a public company, it's really easy to fall prey to an idea that will generate short-term profits and growth, even though long-term it may not be the best fit for your company. When I started working with the countries on strategy about 18 months ago, and our first few passes at it, the conversations that we had with the various countries, the countries are responsible for developing their strategy, and then I simply work with them to fine-tune it and to make sure that it's consistent and that it fits. So they're doing the real heavy lifting because they have to know the local market. When we first started having conversations around strategy, the conversations were, I would say, they were probably C-level. If you were to give it a grade, it was C-level. But the thing that I noticed about our conversation is that everyone ended the conversation kind of happy. You know, that was good enough. Kind of high-five each other and go out to eat somewhere. This year, as we've gotten better at thinking strategically, and we've gotten better at really drilling down into our plans, we found a couple of things. First off, our conversations are more thorough. But second, and more interestingly, they've become more pointed and more uncomfortable, much more uncomfortable. And that, in and of itself, is not a bad thing at all. Because to arrive at really good differentiating strategy means that you are saying no to a whole lot of things, but you're saying yes to a finite list of things. And if the conversation is too agreeable to too many people, you probably are not having a good strategy conversation, if that makes any sense at all. So that's one of the observations that I've had. We've become a lot better at thinking strategically and planning strategically, but we certainly have a lot longer to go, a long ways to go. So what are some of the deliverables from a good strategic conversation? Well, I'm not going to go through these one by one, but we've already talked about that great focus, the great ability to differentiate yourself from the competition, the ability to allocate resources, particularly human resources. Human resources, I think we're finding, and I don't think this is unique to Principal, are the hardest to find, and the ones that you need to take the most care with in terms of developing them and retaining them and treating them well, because they are the principal. They are who is going to make the strategy work. Execution, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And of course, if you do all this right, what you get is long-term growth and profitability. So let me ask you something. As you think about what you know about strategy, and you still have a strategic thinking course, right? You did for
in business school, you have to take a business strategy class, business 180.
Okay, is that an entry level or is that it's upper level class? How many of you have had that? How many of you have had the strategy course? Okay, so not a whole lot, some of you. So just in general, from what you know about strategy, do you think that there's a difference between international and domestic or U.S. strategy? Yes? Tell me more about that. What do you think is different? Anybody? Just yell it out. Yes, please.
Well, a lot of domestic strategies differ from many international strategies because people are from different countries. There's different sentiments about certain colors, any kind of small difference makes a big difference somewhere else.
Good. So you have to think about the local culture. Yes?
I think what's really important about international strategy is that you're dealing with so much more, so your business is spread out and it's really hard to control it. And so how are you going to implement your ideas and how are you going to control what they do over there? It's really hard to coordinate.
Absolutely. So there's a big local impact. What works in one country will not work in another country. Yes?
I actually just learned about this today. It's the difference between localization and adaptation.
Yeah.
Are you selling to the market or are you selling to the culture of the market?
Amen. Did you learn that here at Drake?
This morning, right in this room.
Really? That is spot on. I wish I would have known that. I would have used that in my slide. That is really very true. That is a great, great summary. So what I would submit to you is that your basic, the fundamental of your strategy, what you're trying to do, can be consistent across the U.S. and can be consistent globally. But how that is deployed, how that actually meets the street, how that plays out to the consumer must be fine-tuned and geared towards the local market. Otherwise, you're selling to an audience that you don't know. Okay? So how this translates then into our hiring strategy within Principal International, we have about 3,000 employees in Principal International. How many would you guess are in Des Moines? And Consuelo, you can't answer. Neither can you, Ken. Neither can you, Diego.
I know that only, is it up to 30?
Yeah, you're just spot on.
I think
There's-
Ned said that only up to 30
Yeah.
They hire, like people in Brazil, they hire people from Brazil.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So when you look at Principal International, and you look at our Des Moines staff, we've grown to about 40 now, mostly in finance, financial reporting, risk management, those functions. There's only, with the addition of Ken now, there are, let's see, 5 of us on the team that's looking at strategy, business development, sharing IT, distribution, operations ideas. So we're very much focused on staffing our operations in the local countries, because that's how you bring a strategy to the local market and make it work there. So that's very important to us. So it really gets into not only having the right strategy that can transcend, and again, our overarching strategy is to take the retirement franchise and the long-term savings franchise that we've developed in the United States, and export that into growing markets that have growing middle class and good, strong GDP growth, that have the right laws in place that would encourage long-term savings and retirement savings. But the way that plays out and the way that's actually deployed will depend on the customs, the laws, and the people of that local market. So the challenges are huge, but the opportunities are also huge. There's lots of ways to mess it up. And I think the quickest way to mess it up is to quit listening to the local people. If you quit listening to the local management team, and if you assume that we know better than they do because we're from the United States and we have the mature retirement products and the mature mutual fund and retail offerings here, and if we assume that we have all of the best practices, then that's the first step to sub-optimizing our results. So a little bit about working internationally, and then I'll open it up here pretty quickly for anything that you guys want to talk to or go towards. Working internationally has some differences, of course, from working in the U.S. Some of them are very obvious. Some of them are more subtle. I think probably the thing that strikes me the quickest, the thing I noticed right off the bat when coming into Principal International, in addition to just the different languages and the different cultures, which of course are there. But when you're working domestically, you kind of know that emails are going to stop around 11 o'clock at night, and they're going to start again about 7 in the morning. Well, it's those Asians. So what happens is, you know, we go to bed, and the Asians are waking up, and they're sending you all their questions and messages and correspondence, so that when you wake up, your inbox is full. And so it's really working 24/7 in many respects in terms of, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you have insomnia, there's always somebody to talk to. Somebody in one of our locations is also awake and wanting to talk. So maybe that's the first thing. There certainly is a lot of travel for my position. Ned travels even more than I do, and Luis travels more than all of us. But I do a fair amount of traveling. Certainly there are language differences. I am probably one of the last hires in Principal International that is not bilingual. It is essential for future hires within Principal International to be bilingual. It doesn't cut it to be like me. You have to know another language. Spanish would be great. Mandarin is great. Those are the two most important. From there, Portuguese for Brazil. India is English speaking in terms of the constituency that we deal with are predominantly English speaking. Malaysia is English speaking. So I guess really looking for new hires will either know Mandarin or Spanish, most likely. The pace of working internationally, it feels fast, but I think it's because, like I said, there's no break. There's not this 11 to 7 downtime that you get. It's a constant, somebody's always ringing in. And the other thing is that if you want to have meetings with Asia, you're either going to have them very early in the morning or very late at night. And so that extends your workday. And then traveling, while it's a ton of fun, traveling to Asia will usually wipe out a weekend. So it extends your work life from that way as well. Communication complexities, cultural complexities, they are certainly there. A cultural awareness can do nothing but help. But I'm not so sure that's all that different from what we expect of ourselves when we go to work with a client company in the United States. You need to know about their background. You need to know as much as you can about the culture. And probably nobody understands that better than those of you who are getting ready to do your job search, right? That's the first thing you look at. You try to figure out what's the corporate background, business, and culture. Take that microcosm, and it's the same thinking, perhaps internationally. And then the last thing I'll touch on is having the right skills. I get a lot of people asking, you know, what are you looking for in Principal International? What kind of employees make good employees in Principal International? And there are several things that I would share with you. First off, the more specific and the more precise you can be on a certain field of study, the better off you're going to be. So strategy tends to be one of those really broad fields that it's tough to be a good strategist without having operated a business, without having been in lots of different functions, lots of different business phases. It's far easier to go into Principal International if you have a keen bent towards finance, towards accounting, towards marketing, towards actuarial sciences, something that you are interested in that can more immediately give a return to the principal. And I would suggest that's probably similar to a lot of companies would feel the same way. Like I said, most of the hiring that we do is in country. It's not in Des Moines. Language skills are increasingly more important. And the other thing that I would tell you, and Ken's our first hire along these lines. So Ken and I work together. Do you know Ken? Ken, raise your hand. This is Ken Yu. So Ken is a Drake grad. His hometown is near Shanghai, China. And we are developing our business in China. So Ken joined our team with the understanding that we will teach him everything that we possibly can about our retirement and investor services operations here domestically. And then, when the time is right, we'll move him either to Hong Kong, to Beijing, Shanghai, depending on where our business is, and he'll continue to work for Principal International, but on a local basis. So that's a model that we're just starting, and I'm very enthused about. Because one of the things that I didn't mention is that in China, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and India, our business is through joint ventures. We have joint venture partners. And so Principal is expected to bring to the table expertise in retirement and investor services. We usually have terrific relationships at the executive levels, but where we need feet on the street, where we need hands on the deck, is that mid-level management team that can really help us grow the business, that are of the culture, from the culture, know the culture, but know what we've done domestically to export. So thus, Ken is our very first, and certainly not the last person that we will hire that's of a different culture being groomed here, but hopefully we'll take that back to culture in China or Hong Kong. Make sense? Okay. So we have 15 minutes left, and I will take this conversation wherever you want to take it. I'm not sure where you want to go with it. So, what do you want to know? Yes?
So, you were talking about how Principal is exporting the brand and the knowledge. So, are you just going to stay in Latin America or China? Or are you thinking about expanding more in Latin America and China, Asia, or are you just going to expand in another region as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, when Principal International was first started, in the mid-'80s, we were actually in Spain and Argentina as well. And we tried our hand in England. And what we learned was those aren't great markets. Argentina, the whole economy fell apart. That was a very sad story. But looking at England and looking at Spain, we quickly realized that we're better off going into emerging markets that have fast-growing GDPs and have fast-growing middle class. So that's our first criteria. We will enter those markets that are emerging, that have good GDP growth and good middle class. So that makes it Asia or Latin America. right now, if you look at the markets that we're in, going back to that map, we have 50% of the world population covered in those markets. So our challenge is not going broad. We need to go deep in those markets because in many, many markets we have, like in China, we have less than China, we have a 1.8% market share in China. That's, we've got a long ways to go in China. In Hong Kong, we have a 3.5% market share. In Brazil, we have a 17% market share. In Chile, with the acquisition that we just made, we have an 18% market share. So our first challenge is to go deep in the markets that we're in. But if somebody handed us a bundle of money and said, you go out and you go into a new market, our first choice would probably be Colombia. Yeah, followed quickly by Peru. We have a very strong franchise in Latin America, and those markets are beginning to mature. The political and their governments are beginning to stabilize. They're beginning to have favorable legislation towards long-term savings. So that might be where we go. In Asia, it would likely be the Philippines. What else? That was a good question, by the way. Yes?
What culture was the most difficult to strategically plan
I tell you, the toughest nuts to crack from a strategy perspective are India and China, for different reasons. In India, the government, it's a highly, highly regulated market in India. So they have 1.3 billion people, but it's enormously regulated. And they seem to be anti-private enterprise, as near as we can tell. They don't seem to like us much. It's tough to make money in India. Because what we're doing is, in India, we're selling mutual funds. And the Indian government determined that the salespeople shouldn't be paid. So, imagine you have a product and you can't pay anybody to sell it. That's really hard. That's essentially what they've done. But through traditional methods. So the only way you can sell product in India is on a fee-for-service basis, which means that in India, what we've had to do is to create a whole team of salespeople who do financial planning on a fee-for-service basis. And then the mutual fund sale, they don't get compensated for that on top, if that makes any sense. That's a tough, tough market. Plus, in Asia, people save like crazy. Getting them to save money, that's no problem. Asians can teach us all lessons on how to save. That's not the issue. But they're not always investing in the investment vehicles that we typically invest in the United States, mutual funds, retirement plans, things of that nature. And that's probably our biggest issue in China. So, quick question for you. This is a little quiz. Think the mutual fund industry in the United States. Okay? How long would you guess that the average person, when they buy a mutual fund in the United States, how long on average would you guess they hold it? Anybody? 2 years. Ooh, that's very close. It's actually 3 years. That's very good, by the way. That's good. So 3 years. Okay, in China, on average, how long would you guess the average person holds a mutual fund? You can't answer. 30 years? Oh, I wish. 3 months.
I was going to say very short.
Very, very short. They actually, the mutual fund industry in China, it's just fascinating to me. It's a IPO market, and by that, when we think of IPOs in the United States, you think of a company that's an initial public offering. They go through the IPO process, they sell stock, there's a big pop, then everyone sells it, the IPO market here. But then, long-term, people buy and they hold a stock. China is an IPO market, but with mutual funds. So essentially, so what happens is, we introduce a fund to the marketplace, everyone buys it, they wait for the pop, they get 10% appreciation, they sell it, and they're out. So they're day trading mutual funds. That makes it a little tough if you're in the long-term savings market. So one of the things that we've done, we just finished, is we commissioned Nielsen to go in and do really in-depth study on the behaviors and the attitudes of the individual investors so that we can create a strategy bottoms up on figuring out how do we change investor attitudes and behaviors in China. And that's one of our biggest issues there. It's really an interesting market. 1.2 billion people. Here's another thing that just blows my mind. So our JV partner in China is it's China Construction Bank. Okay, so we're joint ventured with China Construction Bank because they're the ones who get the local culture. They're the ones with the brand, and they have distribution galore. They have like 17,000 branches. So CCB has 360 million retail customers compared to, what's the population of the United States? About 310 million. So our JV partner has more customers than the United States has people. Wow, we have got to crack this nut. There's just a world of opportunity in China, but it's not going to come from the guilos like me. It's going to come from the people who are in the market, who understand it, who can help crack that nut. What else? Yes.
I have one question. So in Malaysia and Indonesia, you
Yes.
guys are doing Islamic asset management.
Yes.
So from that map that you showed just now, why there's no Middle East countries?
In the Middle East? Again, what we're looking for are countries that have rapidly growing middle class. And that's the piece that happens to be missing for us right now in the Middle East. We don't see that swell of middle class people who are that we think give us a big enough market. The day will come perhaps when we're there. But in Malaysia and Southeast Asia, that middle class is absolutely growing. And you're right, we are Principal, and it's really Principal Global Investors, is an expert in Sharia investments and in Islamic funds. Yeah. Yes?
We can lost from the point that you say it's hard to get into the Indian market.
Yes.
What major reason principles they try to penetrate the Indian market even though it's hard?
Yeah. You know, what's really interesting, if you're an athlete and you're training to run, or you're weightlifting or whatever, you quickly learn that you try to, as you're practicing, you try to load yourself down with extra weight if you're running, backpacks if you're running, anything to give you that big endurance. And if you're weightlifting, I'm not a weightlifter, but if you are, you lift far more than what you should until you get into the meet, and then you can lift easily. That's what India does to us. It is our backpack. And here's what I mean by that. When you look at India, the regs are not in our favor for doing traditional distribution through, our partner there is Punjab National Bank. But we can't pay distributors the way you can in the rest of the markets that we're in. So we have to do a fee for service, and we have to do an advisory model. If we can figure out how to crack that nut in India, we can take what we've learned in India and quickly move it to China and to Chile and Mexico. So that's such a good question, by the way. So what we've learned from India, first off, our little India team is really good at getting things done. IT people are everywhere in India. So while in the United States, you have to beg to get IT resources because there's not a lot of IT resources, and they're all really expensive and they're all really busy. In India, IT is a ready resource. So our Indian team has created all these amazingly cool web apps for planning that we can take and put into other markets. So if we can crack the nut in India, we know we're going to be able to crack it in the other markets where we need advisory services. Yeah. That's why we're there. What else? Yes?
I realize that most of your business overseas through joint ventures and merger and acquisition. What is the primary factors you choose that certain companies to merge or to join?
Yeah, so why is it? What are we looking for? So, if you were to ask, actually, I just came from a board meeting in Santiago, a principal board meeting, and I presented our JV strategy, and it was just on this issue. So you think like our board. So if you're starting a business in a country, you probably wouldn't say, gee, I want to take minority ownership in a joint venture. That might not be your first pass. You would probably want to have control if you could, right? But here's the practical implications of that. It takes a crap load of money to go into a new culture and to start a viable business. And what you most need is you need people that are in that country that are acculturated, that are smart, and that can help you, that have the right networks with the government and the rest of the business in that company, that culture. So you need the cultural connections, and you also need distribution. Distribution is the holy grail. Honest to goodness. If you can get distribution, powerful distribution, and by the way, CCB, our China partner, is the picture of distribution strength. In a 2-week period in last year, in December, they sold $2 billion worth of mutual funds. $2 billion. U.S. operations, that's a year. $2 billion in 2 weeks. Now, 90 days later, it's all gone. But really good distribution. So we're looking for distribution. And what we bring to the table then is that deep understanding of retirement and long-term savings, and we know how to run the company. So we take what we know, we put it with that JV partner, and for a very reasonable return on investment, remember it all comes down to the numbers, all comes down to the money eventually, for a good return on investment, we can get into a country, get up and running, and get market share. Whereas if we tried to do it greenfield, it's riskier, far more expensive, and you can just start to churn your talent. Talent is by far our toughest resource to get and to maintain. Yeah. Okay. Is there one last question from anybody? Yes?
What do you think is one of the ways to maintain your talent in the company?
Yeah. You know what? I have a whole lot to say on that subject as a result of winding down health. Let me give you just a real quick story, because everybody has a different view on how you maintain talent and how you groom talent and what makes talent stick around. But this actually happened, and it was an amazing experience for me personally and professionally. So in September of 2010, we announced that we were exiting the health insurance division. And there were 1,500 people who worked in the health insurance division. And it was decided that I was going to lead the organization through the wind down. So on September 30th, 2010, I fired 1,500 people, including myself. So we all had termination dates. Okay? We all had dates that we knew we were no longer going to be with the company. But here's the real kicker. You can't just terminate health insurance business because there's this long liability tail. And the state insurance departments aren't going to let you exit those markets. So we had to have people on board for 3 years. We still have a core of health employees on board today in 2013, needed to wind down the business and to keep us out of litigation and to keep our brand and our brand strong, because we want to be known as a good, ethical, stand-up company. So I fired everybody on September 30th of 2010, but I couldn't let them go, all of them, until 3 years later, right? So now I've got to convince them to stay with me. What's the odds that if somebody fired you at the end of December, September, that you're going to be there 6 months later, right? Not so good, right? So suddenly, it's all about how you retain and develop talent. So we completely changed the value proposition within the health division. And what we did was we said, look, we're going to tell you your release date. True, you're not going to work for the principal. You're not going to work for the health division anymore because there is no health division. If you get a job with the principal, that's fantastic. And we're going to try to help you do that. But I can't promise you there's not 1,500 jobs. Turns out there were 500 of them, but there weren't 1,500. So then, in order to get people to stay, because now you're truly dealing with a volunteer workforce, right? You fired everybody, and you've got to get them to stay for 3 years, some of them. So it changes the whole thing around, and it changes it to a conversation about what are you most interested in learning? Where do you want to be on your release date? What industry do you want to be in? Where do you want to work? I'll help you get there. I'll help you develop the skills. I'll help you network. I'll help you get what you need to springboard to your next career. And you know what? Here's the really ironic part. Our turnover was less than the company in terms of unplanned turnover. And here's the real kicker. Our employee opinion surveys were the best in the company after we fired everybody. So I have a lot to say about development. That's a very unorthodox approach. Don't try that at home. Okay. I think we're done. Thank you very, very much.